Unity Water is proud to sponsor this podcast series because we believe great news, great solutions and great outcomes deserve to be shared. See what we're all about at unitywater.com. You're listening to the Australian Water Association's podcast series.
I'm Hazel Flynn, and joining me now is Dr. Peter Naderbaum, Principal Environment at GHD, talking to us about those troublesome substances known as PFAS. Hello, thanks for joining us.
Good, Hazel. Yep.
So, tell us about them, what they are, why they're a problem.
PFAS, they're very prevalent in, been used very widely, and what's happened over the last decade is that it's become apparent that these are present in the environment and they're potentially causing a problem to humans and also to ecological systems. And so what's been determined is that there's been significant use in particular areas, particularly related to firefighting, for example, and that's resulted in relatively high concentrations of these PFAS compounds and in particular areas, and that's caused problems with regard to contamination of water, soil, and eventually getting into animals, fish and so forth. And so it's this realisation that the PFAS are quite widely found that's caused a great focus on them, and so a lot of money is now being spent on identifying where these PFAS compounds are, whether they're posing a problem, and therefore what the response is. And one of the great difficulties with PFAS is that they're bioaccumulative, and so what happens is that relatively small concentrations, very low concentrations in water, for example, can magnify up in fish, and so almost undetectable concentrations in water can result in very unacceptable concentrations in fish and some other organisms, and it's that problem which has tended to focus the issue, and these compounds also bioaccumulate in humans, and so we can measure it, and that's caused a lot of concern. We can see that it's in our bodies, it's in fish and things like that, in certain areas. It's not throughout the environment, but it's because we can measure it, we can see it, and it's causing consternation and concern that we should be minimising this, we should be avoiding it if possible. And so a lot of money is being directed towards that very area of identifying where these problems are and minimising them.
And as you say, these the PFAS, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, firefighting foam was one of the things you mentioned, and
Sure.
That's obviously been in the news lately. It's been of great concern in certain areas, but I mean, they're used in things like pizza boxes, is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, they're very widespread, and obviously, Teflon, where people have been using it for a long time, but they're much more widely spread than that. They're into, you'll find it in carpets, in leather protection, stain protection, Gore-Tex. You'll find these substances very widely spread in the environment, and all different types of PFAS. There's a lot of range in chemical terms, and firefighting and fire protection has been particularly singled out because there's relatively large quantities that have been used in fire training, and that's been released to the environment, whereas a lot of these other substances will be attached to leather and carpet and so forth, and that material is disposed of, but it's disposed of in a solid form, a lot of it, and it goes into landfills and things like that, and so the amount that is released to the environment and the rate of which it's released to the environment is less. And so it's more these areas where there's been direct release in relatively large quantities that has caused the focus.
And you mentioned Teflon too. Am I right in recalling that I think DuPont has stopped making Teflon for lining of pans? They've switched to a different substance for this reason?
Look, there's been a lot of phasing out of the PFAS compounds. To my knowledge, they're still being used quite widely. There is a lot of effort in firefighting, for example, to identify alternative, non-fluorine containing compounds, but the difficulty is that they are very effective compounds. And if you want to put out a fire, which is the primary purpose, for example, you've got to be pretty careful about using alternative compounds which won't be as effective, because the primary issue is to put the fire out and save people's lives. If you're going to use an alternative which is not as good, it's a difficulty. So, in terms of phasing out, yes, there's a lot of effort to try and phase out these compounds, but there's still a lot in use, and still countries manufacturing them.
And what kinds of specific problems do they cause? I mean, you talked about them accumulating in organisms. What problems do they cause in humans and in other parts of the environment?
Well, it's a very interesting issue, and even it's been a subject of considerable focus, by our health departments, for example, in Australia, to try and work out, well, just what is the problem with these compounds, and are they causing a problem? And there was an independent review let's go back one step, on a precautionary basis, because we can measure it and we can see that accumulating in people. So the health department's response to that is concern. We need to set criteria which are very stringent, which will make sure that to minimise people's uptake of these compounds on a precautionary basis. And then the question is, well, what effects are they actually having? And there was an independent review commissioned by the Health Department, Commonwealth Health Department, and released only on Monday. And that was a group of independent experts reviewing the issue, and they came to the conclusion that there still wasn't persuasive evidence of particular health effects. They went through a whole lot of possible health effects which have been flagged by international agencies, by Australian agencies. There's been studies and things like that, and they looked at the evidence to see if in fact there are persuasive, there's good evidence to show that there is actual health effects to humans, and the jury is still out of it. Even though we're spending a large amount of money to minimise exposure, which is, I think, a precautionary good response, but we're doing it on a precautionary basis without necessarily having very clear evidence that people are getting sick as a result of this exposure.
Do you think that's because we haven't been studying it for long enough? Is it a relatively recent awareness that there might be an issue?
Well, look, that's an interesting question in its own right, because we have been using these compounds for a long time, for many decades, and there's been some very substantial occupational exposures, and there are groups in the community, firefighters and things like that, have had quite a considerable exposure. But it's hard to track down, in fact, that even with these relatively highly exposed groups, that there is serious effects. And so that's obviously what the epidemiologists, the health people, look for, to see if we can see these health effects in these more highly exposed groups. And look, it's actually not an easy thing to sort out and sift out from other effects and other causes as to whether or not it's related to this particular group of chemicals. And so that's the problem that we face. So the response of our agencies is to say, we don't quite know, but let's nevertheless minimise exposure. Let's put very tight controls on these things. Let's spend, in fact, a lot of money, minimising this problem.
Can you get that genie back in the bottle?
In what way, Hazel?
In the sense that you said that they were so widespread in the environment that talking about having strict controls on them, is that feasible?
Yeah, well, look, there's two different approaches actually. One way is to tackle that, in terms of manufacture and use, and you can see that now that these compounds used to be widely spread around in fire training, for example, where you would discharge as a matter of requirement, to train your firefighters, and you'd have to spray it around and check that all your systems were working and things like that. And so it was a matter of requirement that relatively large quantities were sprayed around. Now that's all stopped, and now that they'll be training with other materials and things like that, and so that a lot of this release to the environment has basically drawn right back and stopped or largely ceased. And so what you see now is, in studies, is that the amount of PFAS in people's blood, for example, is decreasing over the last few decades. It's decreasing remarkably, and so that's reflecting the fact that PFAS is being much less used and released to the environment. Nevertheless, there are concentrations of PFAS in areas where it has been used, significantly. For example, in firefighting, and so in those areas, you'll find concentrations in what we call source areas, where this material might be present and might leach out, release from those areas. And so what the focus is now is on, it's several-fold. It's really identifying these source areas and controlling those. And so if you control those, you'll stop the leaching and moving out into the environment. And so quite in an additive way, you'll be having stopped the use, that's decreasing, having contained and controlling the source areas, that will further accelerate the decrease in the environment. Where the materials got into groundwater and into the broader environment, it's very difficult to do anything about that. And so it's probably one more of seeing this this contamination decrease with time. Unless there is something very urgent, where if people are drinking it, then you can stop them drinking it and give them alternative water supplies and things like that. You might be able to cut off the groundwater and things like that and stop these issues. But it's much more difficult if this material, if these PFAS have actually got out and distributed. Very difficult to do anything about that.
So we have much yet to learn.
Well, we've got a lot to learn, and from a technical point of view, it's a very interesting issue.
Indeed. Well, thank you for coming in and sharing your expertise with us.
Good.
And that was Dr. Peter Naderbaum, Principal of Environment at GHD, and thanks for listening.